and to sit at the dialogue table and participate in defining the present and the future of Syria. We do not wager on any party or factor apart from the Syrian people, who are uniformly determined to reject all forms of foreign interference in their domestic affairs and to defeat the advocates of the project of sectarianism, extremism, and terrorism, because the bond is very strong in my country between the policies of the state and the aspirations of the people. Mr. President, despite everything I have described on what my country is living through, we still believe in a political solution as an essential way out of this crisis. And from this platform, I call for the following. First, I call on all parties and political groups inside and outside Syria to engage in a constructive dialogue under the umbrella of the homeland. The doors of Syria, as is her heart, are open to anyone who wants constructive dialogue, and to achieve this, I call all countries represented in the General Assembly to exert pressure to end the violence in my country through putting an end to the arming, financing, harboring, and training of armed terrorist groups. Second, the results of this national dialogue, after agreement by all parties, shall be the map and the future way of the country in establishing a Syria that is more pluralistic and democratic. Mr. President, these events in Syria have led to growing humanitarian needs in several key sectors in areas affected by the terrorism of Takfiri groups. This has led to the worsening of the living conditions of Syrian citizens. And while my government is working hard to meet the basic needs of citizens who have been forced by the violence of armed groups to flee their homes, some have sought to fabricate a refugee crisis in neighboring countries through inciting armed groups to intimidate Syrian civilians in border areas and forcing them to flee to neighboring countries. There, they're either accommodated in military training bases or in what resembles places of detention amid arid or rugged regions, and exploit their plight to gather aid that is mostly spent on ends which have nothing to do with humanitarian objectives. I appeal from this podium to those Syrian citizens to return to their towns and villages where the Syrian state will guarantee their safe return and their precious lives away from the inhuman conditions they suffer in these camps. At this point, allow me to ask a legitimate question about the credibility of those who claim to care for providing humanitarian access as a response to the needs of the Syrians, and to question the consistency of these claims with a policy of tightening economic sanctions that are badly affecting the living conditions of these same citizens whose interests those imposing the sanctions claim to serve. How can imposing sanctions on the banking, health, and transport sectors be consistent with caring for the best interests of the Syrians? I also wonder if the legitimate public demands of our citizens, to which our Syrian leadership has responded transparently and sincerely, whether these demands can justify their use by some as an excuse to continue providing all forms of military, financial, and media support to those killing innocents in Syria, including journalists, doctors, university professors, and even religious figures. Or is this simply another practical interpretation of the concept of creative chaos, which only contributes to strengthening Western hegemony on Mediterranean countries and which serve only Israel's expansionist interests? Mr. President, what is happening in my country must not lead us to lose our basic focus, which is Palestine and the Golan. Therefore, the Syrian Arab Republic confirms its adherence to her natural right to restore the full occupied Syrian Golan up to the June 6, 1967 borders. Syria stresses its refusal and rejection of all measures taken by Israel, the occupying power, to change the natural, geographic, and aspects of the Golan in a clear violation of the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, particularly Resolution 497 of the year 1981. Syria renews its support for the legitimate call upon the international community to recognize a free and independent Palestinian state on the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. The failure of efforts to achieve a just and comprehensive peace in the Middle East on the basis of the international terms of reference endorsed by the international community as a basis for peace between Palestinians and Israelis is due, as everyone knows, to the unilateral positions and actions of Israel, especially Israel's insistence on continuing its settlement policy and its evasion of the requirements of peace. Mr. President, my country renews its call upon the international community to work on freeing the Middle East of all weapons of mass destruction. In this context, we recall the initiative presented at the end of 2003 during its membership of the Security Council by Syria, and we call upon the Council to adopt it. Syria stresses that clearing the region of all weapons of mass destruction will not be achieved without making Israel, the only nuclear power in the region, abide by joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and placing its nuclear facilities under the inspection regime of the International Atomic Energy Agency. At the same time, we emphasize on the stipulations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which guarantee the rights of all states to acquire nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. Mr. President, the insistence of the United States and countries of the European Union and others to impose unilateral economic measures violates the regulations of international law and the principles of free trade and raises questions about the legality and morality of such practices. Based on this, we call for lifting the embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States for decades. We also renew our call for lifting and stopping all unilateral coercive measures imposed on the peoples of other countries such as Venezuela, Belarus, Iran, Syria, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Mr. President, our aspiration to achieve positive reform of the international organization stems from our desire to find a world based on justice, security, and prosperity for all the peoples of the world, away from the colonial hegemonic tendencies of some countries that seek to exploit the United Nations to achieve their own interests at the expense of other countries. We hope that the United Nations can take the people of the world to a better future that fulfills their aspirations for life, coexistence, development, and food sufficiency, and away from all forms of tension, confrontation, and war, pursuant to what the United Nations Charter stipulates in its principles and purposes, which seek to preserve the sovereignty of states and equality among them in rights